Thank you. Well, hi. Great to be here again tonight. And it is special for me to be able to deliver this talk because it pulls together some things that I've been thinking about for some years and that I know a number of you have been thinking about for years. And as Greg was saying, I've never delivered a talk on this particular topic, but it became a very intimate part of my life, the idea of the occult and women's rights, the occult and women's liberation, when I was working on my first book, Occult America, because I found this extraordinary and unexpected congruity between the flowering and the upsurge of occult philosophy and liberatory movements all over the world, in America in particular, but all over the world. The movement to emancipate India from British colonial rule, movements toward abolitionism, movements toward women's suffrage, anti-colonial movements, movements to protect the right of the individual to conduct his or her own spiritual or ethical search without molestation of government or church, all coincided very plainly and very directly with upsurges in occult activity. And in many cases, and this was particularly true with regard to the dawn of the women's voting rights and suffragist movement in America, they even shared leadership. Radical political thought movements and avant-garde religious or spiritual movements have been wound together like strands of DNA through much of modern life, in America in particular, but in other parts of the world as well. Now, I want to take a step back from this subject for a moment before I re-enter it. I find that this being Halloween season, I'm always hearing from people. I get very popular in the mainstream media once a year, and it starts October 1st for some mysterious reason. And that's when everybody from NPR and the Wall Street Journal decides that it's time to trot out the yearly Ouija board story or the seance story, and it's time to reconsider this Madame Blavatsky and who was she, and let's do a story about goblins and call this guy. And so I'm always hearing from mainstream journalists around the Halloween season. And I find that the interviews and the discussions very frequently follow a certain template. And I have objections to both aspects of this template, which I'm always very plain in telling them about. The first part of the template is always the presumption that there's some kind of an occult revival going on in our country. There's a perpetual occult revival, a perpetual rediscovery of the occult going on in America. And the occult is basically an evergreen on the American scene. It has been going back in many regards to the country's colonial days, and it goes through periods of resurgence. Sometimes something like The Secret will come along and will ramp up a degree of interest in some aspect of New Age or occult subject matter. Sometimes something from the entertainment world will come along and ramp up interest in the Ouija board. But there's very often this starting premise among some academics and many journalists that somehow each time Halloween season comes around, as if it doesn't fall every single year, it must be indicative of some resurgence of interest in the occult. And then that's followed by a second template premise, which is that this resurgence of interest in the occult is a response to economic or cultural or sociological factors going on through the society. if there's the presumption that there's some kind of economic anxiety that's returning people to primeval spirituality, or Trump is returning people to primeval spirituality, or the uncertainty of changes in our culture due to digital commerce or digital ways of communicating is returning people to primeval forms of spirituality. And I think those premises are almost always cliched. I think those premises are almost always shop-worn. And those premises of a rediscovery of the occult and of this supposed rediscovery being attributable to sociological or economic causes really are in service to avoiding a much deeper question and a much more primal question. And that is the fact that occult ideas and methods and ways of thought are evergreens and are always with us and are always present because they contain compelling truth, because they contain a legitimate magnetic pull on the psyche, because people find within them expressions of self that can't be located or replicated in any other part of the society, including consumerism, including mainstream congregational religion, including in materialism. But the contention that occult ideas and philosophies function as a fount of truth and meaning is something that many academics, not all, and most journalists will never consider. So they always lurch for and they reach for the sociological explanation. It's been the same sociological explanation for 100 years, and it's very unimpressive. Every generation feels that it's facing some kind of crisis. Every generation feels like we're on the edge, we're on the brink, this is virtually the end. And although there are things to be very disturbed about in our current society, I always have to point out to people, yes, there are worrisome things, but compare where we stand to where the generation that went through World War I stood. 20 million people died of the flu in the wake of World War I, including in major metropolises, including in New York City. Can you imagine, commensurate with the increase in population numbers, how we would all be reacting if an equivalent number of people died today of an infectious disease? Of course, we would ignore it if it wasn't happening in the Western world, but this did happen in the Western world. But we get upset and angry and incensed over tweets and things like that. Every generation feels it's in a state of crisis. So I don't think that occult spirituality or any other kind of avant-garde expression automatically re-arises because of anxiety. I think there's something deeper going on. I think there's something more significant going on. And I'm always urging people within academia and within mainstream media to at least consider the possibility that people's testimonies as to their experiences with anomalous phenomena are actually correct, are accurate, before lurching immediately towards the sociological or economic explanation. I was having a discussion, this being Halloween season, I was having a discussion several days ago with a reporter from the Atlantic Monthly who was writing a piece on, guess what? The resurgence of the occult. And he was a good guy. And he actually did have an interesting angle on the piece, and he was correct in the premise that he was coming from. He made the observation, very rightly, that there has been a huge uptick of demand in the United States for exorcisms, for church-sanctioned exorcisms. And he pointed out, quite correctly, that the number of church-sanctioned exorcists in America has actually quintupled over about the past dozen years. And that is correct. That is absolutely correct. So I saluted him for starting from a premise that's factually absolutely right. And we got to talking again about why this is. And again, out come the presumptions of, well, there's economic anxiety, because that's brand new. And I said, listen, the fact is, I think if you want to talk on the plane of just material culture, I would say probably this uptick of church-certified exorcists, to some extent, is one of many belated reactions that the church has been having over the past generation to the reforms of Vatican II. The conservative pushback against Vatican II is intermingled with a kind of mysticism within the church. It's difficult for reporters to sometimes understand that which is called the conservative and that which is called the mystical are sometimes the same thing in the Catholic Church. And a return to certain forms of mystical devotion and belief in the supernatural is both a conservative response to Vatican II, but also one that reinvites the mystical into the church, and the church sees itself as the opponent of so-called dark forces, and so the certification and the validation of the exorcism rite, to some extent, is a latter-day and somewhat belated reaction to the reforms of Vatican II. But I said to him, bearing that in mind, if you really want to look at this question comprehensively, I wouldn't take off the table the possibility that maybe there are more exorcists bopping around and requests for exorcism because people are experiencing demon possession. How do you know that that's not true? Have you considered the possibility that if people report flying saucer sightings, maybe it's because they're seeing flying saucers? If people report the planchette moving around the Ouija board in mysterious ways and Captain Howdy is threatening people, maybe it's because that's exactly what's happening. Why would you take the non-physical off the table? Why not at least suspend that as a question among these other questions, including the sociological, including the material? Just suspend it as a question. We'll see. You'll have the same opportunity as I will to read the article when it comes out in a few days. I strongly doubt his editors are going to let him say, and of course there is also the possibility that demonic possession is on the upswing. And, then there's also the question of whether that's a bad thing. That's a whole other topic that he and I talked about. And I said, well, from my perspective, it's something you pursue. So, I realize that for some people it's extremely inconvenient. But it was an interesting conversation. You'll have the same chance to read the article as I do. It'll be out in a few days. It'll be the only article on demonic possession in the Atlantic Monthly, so you will not miss it. But that leads me to a consideration of tonight's topic, which I introduced in brief, which is the occult and women's rights. I spoke very briefly and very generally about this really uncanny congruity between upswings in occult activity at certain points in history, which there are. You have the spiritualist movement in mid-19th century America, for example. You have the emergence of Freemasonry above ground in the early 1700s in Britain, later traveling to the American colonies. There are periods in which substantial and divergent and significant things happen in occult history. And these things usually coincide with liberatory movements. And it's interesting to see that if you were to trace out a family tree of occult activity in America, which is one of the things I do in the book Occult America and in other books of mine, there's an enormous and unmistakable presence of female leadership, not only in terms of being the heads of or the instigators of organizations, but in terms of being some of the brightest thought leaders. Just take an example from our contemporary life at this very moment. I referenced The Secret, the hit book and movie. It was one woman, Rhonda Byrne, an Australian woman, who engineered and was behind that entire phenomenon. And it really was an extraordinary phenomenon. And it's always difficult to talk about The Secret because it engenders very polarized feelings. Within the alternative spiritual culture, The Secret has become almost this whipping post that people use to demonstrate their own seriousness. You know, somebody will tell you they're into mind metaphysics and hasten to say, but I'm not into The Secret or any of that garbage, you know. And what I find is that the most vociferous critics of The Secret have never seen the movie nor read the book. Never. Never. And I can always tell. I can tell in as much as a 7th grade English teacher knows who has and hasn't read Lord of the Flies. I mean, you know immediately. And this is true of all of you. You can tell when somebody's faking it. You know, I always know because people will use The Secret as an example of everything that's anemic and unhealthy and unrealistic and unserious about New Age culture. But they're incapable of providing one specific example of what it is that they hate about The Secret, what statement they disagree with, what part of the movie or book they think is corrupt, a prime example of its silliness. And the fact is, I've engaged in criticism of The Secret as well, and I have my criticism of Rhonda Byrne. I admire her accomplishment, but there are areas of deep difference between us. But I thought to myself, The Secret is now celebrating its 10th anniversary. And I decided one night to sit down with one of my kids, he's now 11, but at the time he was 10. And we watched the movie together, and I really quite liked it. I thought the values were basically good, and the premises were basically sound. Everybody always says the problem with The Secret is the end of all spiritual search shouldn't be the attainment of a Mercedes-Benz. There's no Mercedes-Benz in the movie. I have no idea where that comes from. It's like the same notion that the hippies were going around burning the American flag. Was there one instance, of a gathering of hippies burning the American flag? I'm not entirely sure. I have seen Black Lives Matter activists burn the American flag, and I think they had very good reasons for what they were doing. But let's be clear, it's a small number of people. They're making the decision individually. I defend their right to make that decision. But I don't want to use these things as kind of these sensationalistic magnets for hate or for disparagement. It's important that there's actually no Mercedes-Benz manifesting in The Secret. But that has become this thing, this Rorschach that everybody projects onto it, and it's not there. The criticisms that I have of Rhonda actually don't even come from the movie The Secret. They come from statements that she's made as an adjunct to it that represent differences between how she and I see the functioning of mind metaphysics and New Thought. But it's not important. People are always going to have differences. That's of no great importance. What's important is that the work that she did helped expose a whole generation to the possibility that your mind has functions that go beyond the motor and the cognitive, that there's an extra physical dimension to life, that there's an additional possibility in how we can use our minds, and that can start as a place of experimentation. And critics would always say, oh, she called it The Secret, but it's a secret that's been known for 150 years, or it's a secret that goes back to Hermeticism. And I thought to myself, no, they're wrong, because it is a secret of neglect. It's a secret of neglect. The vast majority of people in the Western world had not heard these ideas. And the evidence of that is that the book and the movie that she created almost single-handedly remained on bestseller lists for 18 months, 24 months. There was a whole stream of new people who were hearing about this for the very first time. And as a result, the tide that she created as an artist lifted so many different authors back to prominence whose work hadn't been heard from or read for many, many years, like Wallace Wattles, the author of a book called The Science of Getting Rich, who, ironically, apropos of the title, was a socialist activist in the early 20th century who ran for Congress on the Socialist Party ticket and ran a close second to become mayor of Elwood, Indiana, on the Socialist Party ticket. And the book is actually filled with Marxist-infused ideas about the usurpation and the passing of corporate behemoths in favor of a more creative, cooperative mindset that held the possibility of a society of utopian plenty and economic equity for people of all races, classes, genders, and backgrounds. Rhonda identified the science of getting rich as a prime inspiration for The Secret. That book today is virtually a household term. Virtually everybody who has any familiarity with New Age or motivational spirituality has heard of the science of getting rich. That book was 100 years old and had been completely forgotten until The Secret lifted it back up to prominence. And that was true of many books and many works. This is just one contemporary example of how the vision and the voice of a female intellect completely changed the culture. Completely changed the culture, and she was coming from a perspective of metaphysics that really were a secret in the sense that the vast majority of people had never heard of these ideas. Familiar as they may have been to some of us wingnuts, the vast majority of people had never heard these ideas. There are so many examples like this in American life and in Western life. And they go back to some of the earliest experiences of liberatory politics in America, in Europe, and in other parts of the world. The first woman and the first European president of the Indian National Congress, the committee that basically organized the anti-colonial and independence movement in India during the time of Gandhi, was Annie Besant, who was the successor to Madame H.P. Blavatsky in the Theosophical Society. Last time I was here, in May, I gave a talk on the theme of Occult America, where I talked about the relationship between the Russian occultist Madame H.P. Blavatsky and Mahatma Gandhi when he lived and studied in London in the mid-1880s when Madame Blavatsky was living there. And Gandhi talked in interviews, wrote in articles, letters, and in his diaries about what an enormous influence Madame Blavatsky was on his life when he was a young law student studying in London, achingly desperate to be the very image of a young British barrister. He combed his hair, loaded it down with Brill cream so that it was very straight. He wore a high starched collar. He was extremely lonely because he was a vegetarian, which was not an easy thing to be in London in 1886. He failed his matriculation exams and he was in danger of getting bopped out of law school. And he felt completely lost. And there were these two guys, later turned out to be an uncle and nephew, who befriended him and who said to him that they were Theosophists. And they asked Gandhi if he could help them read the Bhagavad Gita in the original Sanskrit. And Gandhi said he was embarrassed to tell these two guys that he had never read the Gita at all. He thought of Hinduism as something that belonged to his parents' generation, some old superstition that he wanted to throw off. And he wanted to be accepted as a contemporary, late 19th century law student in the most populous and exciting city on earth. But, he said, he recognized Theosophy as, and these were his words, as a pro-Hindu anti-colonial movement. And so he thought of these guys as being friendly figures. He immediately took a liking to them, and he said yes, he would make the effort to help them read the Gita in Sanskrit, and he would read it for the first time himself with them. And they said to him, by the way, have you heard of Madame H.P. Blavatsky? And he was taken aback and said, of course I've heard of Madame Blavatsky, because she and her partner, Colonel Olcott, Colonel Henry Steele Olcott, a retired Civil War colonel, had spent many years in India by that point as advocates of Indian independence, as opponents of the machinery of the British colonial government, and as advocates of a Hindu revival in India. Yes. And they said to him, she's actually staying at our home in Notting Hill. Would you like to meet her? And he was shocked. And he went there and he met her and Annie Besant. And Madame Blavatsky gave him a copy of her book, The Key to Theosophy, of which there is a signed copy in Manly Hall's vault, which some of the people who visited earlier got an opportunity to look at. And he said that he was awestruck when he read The Key to Theosophy, because it was the first book that he had ever encountered in his life that gave him a sense of a universal personhood, a personhood that wasn't defined by caste, religion, background, sex, and this sense of a radical personhood was the first ignition spark that moved him toward his philosophy of universal human brotherhood and sisterhood, of radical universal equality. And I think you can even hear a vestige of Madame Blavatsky's great slogan, "There is no religion higher than truth," in a statement that Gandhi later made, which is, all religions are true. People often quote that without quoting the second part of what Gandhi said. He said, all religions are true and all have some flaw in them. If you read any biography, anywhere, anytime of Gandhi, you may find no mention of Madame Blavatsky. You may find one or two errant mentions of Madame Blavatsky. You may find a mention of Madame Blavatsky with a very hastened effort to disassociate her from having had any serious impact or influence on Gandhi's life. This is true in a fairly recent biography of Gandhi that was written by a brilliant journalist, a man named Joseph Lelyveld, who used to be the executive editor of the New York Times, who I had met with. And when he published his biography of Gandhi, it was almost as if he could barely bring himself to reference Madame Blavatsky without immediately clarifying that she was just this strange, schismatic, unreliable figure who Gandhi immediately distanced himself from. But this wasn't true. This simply wasn't true. There was a biographer of Gandhi's named Lewis Fisher, a British journalist. In fact, if you watch the movie Gandhi starring Ben Kingsley, Lewis Fisher is portrayed by Martin Sheen. And they were close, and Gandhi sat for hours and hours of interviews with him. And even just toward the end of his life, just a couple of years before his assassination, Gandhi told Lewis Fisher, Theosophy is the universal religion of all people. Theosophy is Hinduism at its best. Those were his words. Those were his words. There's much more that I could say on this topic, but this is what I mean when I talk about the fact that there really is an occult history present in our world. There really is a secret history present in our world, and it's secret by way of neglect. It's secret because it gets written out of our histories because journalists, many journalists, I shouldn't overly generalize, many journalists and many academics, although this is slowly changing, are unwilling to consider the possibility that these thought movements contain real power within them, power enough to change a life, power enough to change a nation. India today is the largest democracy in the world. Gandhi was deeply influenced by the occultism of the Theosophical Society, something that he wrote about consistently across the course of his life up to a couple of years following his death. And yet the figure of Madame H.P. Blavatsky, whom Gandhi identified as the earliest source of influence behind his ideas of universal humanity, is all but absent from the biographies that are written of Gandhi, contrary to the things he expressed himself. This is a problem of conformity. It's a problem of intellectual conformity. At this moment in time, and for the past several generations, people who enter opinion-making positions of scholarship and journalism have been miseducated, that looking at a figure like Madame H.P. Blavatsky is a complete waste of time. They find it boring. They find it uninteresting. They think of her as just some sort of carnival huckster who was engaged in spreading false stories about these hidden masters and strange psychical powers. I could speak for a whole evening on her quite easily. I could speak for a week on her. But I just want to interject that one example. The movement I mentioned earlier, the women's suffragist movement in America, is so uniquely a product of occult and arcane spirituality that it's literally almost impossible to understand the gestation of that movement without understanding some of the supernatural aspirations and thought systems that went into it. First of all, to be plain, the very first recognized female religious figures in the New World came up of necessity through occult thought systems, because there was no room and there was no social permission for any woman who wanted a voice in the religious or civic culture to function within mainstream religion. Absolutely no room whatsoever. So what you find are stories of extraordinary individual women who carved out voices for themselves in the culture by creating and sustaining a spirituality that was completely outside of the approved doctrinal forms of Christian spirituality. One early example was a young woman in Rhode Island named Jemima Wilkinson. She was born in 1754 to a reasonably prosperous Quaker farming family in Rhode Island. And she was raised in reasonably comfortable circumstances and was educated along the lines that you would expect a young woman from a fairly prosperous Quaker family to be educated in. She was taught etiquette, manners and morals, light literature, and it was expected that she would get married and become a farm wife, presumably of a reasonably prosperous farmer or perhaps a merchant. That was the straight story. But something went wrong with the straight story. In October of 1776, Jemima, there was a typhoid epidemic sweeping through the New England area. And Jemima took to her bed with typhoid. And she was suffering from a very serious fever. She was slipping in and out of consciousness, and she was having what are sometimes called fever dreams, where she might come back to consciousness, and she reported that she was astrally traveling outside of her body, and she was visiting other realms, visiting other planets, visiting the afterworld. And her parents and everybody who was gathered by her bedside just thought that this was the ramblings of a young woman who, 22 years old, was on the very brink of death. And one night, she fell into a very, very deep, fevered coma, and her family was sitting in a death vigil by her bedside, and everybody was certain that Jemima would not make it until the morning. And suddenly, according to witnesses who were there, she springs up from her bed, all ruddy and red and full of life, sort of skinny and emaciated because of the fever, and she hadn't been eating, but filled with energy and life. And she announces to the people in the room, the woman that you knew as Jemima has traveled to the afterworld, and the being standing in front of you is a channel of the cosmic and the divine spirit, and I will only answer to the name Public Universal Friend. And declaring herself the Public Universal Friend, Jemima the next day, which was a Sunday, goes out to a local churchyard, and she stands under a tree and starts delivering a homily or a sermon under the tree. And people are shocked because this is the very first time that anybody in the neighborhood had ever witnessed a woman delivering an address in public. And most of what Jemima said, and there are some transcripts of it, was fairly just warmed over Quakerism. There was nothing very supernatural in her message. But she claimed to be this walking channel of a spirit of the afterworld, and she actually crisscrossed between British and American battle lines during the Revolutionary War. And later, her followers moved her to upstate New York, which was open to land settlement following the War of Independence. And they decided that they wanted to enshrine their spiritual avatar with a beautiful home of her own in a town that they named Jerusalem, which you can still find on the map in central New York State. And Jemima's house is still there. And she was a very, very controversial figure because many people in central New York State, which her followers had helped to settle, thought of her as an avatar, a prophetess, and others thought of her as a charlatan. And there's a town next to Jerusalem named Penyan, very small town, where I stayed at a haunted hotel one night. If we have time, I'll tell you that story. It was really creepy and alarming. But believe it or not, in Penyan, New York, a very small, beautiful town in central New York State, very rural area, people still know, if you say Public Universal Friend, they know exactly what you're talking about, and they know her, and she was controversial. There's a story that circulates throughout the town. There's all these little stories and parables about her that suggest that, she was a kind of trickster type figure, a figure of slightly ill repute. There's a creek that crosses underneath Main Street in Penyan, New York, and there's a story that goes, Jemima would sometimes do things like she marched a band of followers to the creek by Main Street, and she declared that she was going to walk on water. and she delivered a speech, delivered a sermon, a homily, and then said to her followers, "Do ye have faith that I can do this thing?" And they all said, "Yes, we have faith." And she said, "Good, then there's no need for any vulgar outer display." And she got into her carriage and rode away. And the carriage, which still exists, had the letters UF emblazoned on it, Universal Friend, Universal Friend. This was one of the first female public figures in America. Like Madame Blavatsky, she had to shatter convention. She had to go outside the norm. There was no place else for an educated woman to be heard. And there are several other such figures as Jemima, not all of them as colorful, but all of them unified in being figures who claimed to have some kind of mystical connection to the other world, and who formed followings and congregations that went completely outside of political norms. And eventually, an upsurge of these figures helped form the movement that was known as Spiritualism, talking to the dead. Now, Central New York State, surprisingly, plays a very key role in all of this. And this was something that surprised me as I was working on Occult America. Because if you drive through Central New York State today, you see farmland. It's remarkably untouched. You see some sprawl, but you wouldn't have any sense that this was somehow the springboard of avant-garde thought and spiritual revolution. But a lot went on there. That was the birthplace of Mormonism, birthplace of Spiritualism, birthplace of Seventh-day Adventism. That was where the Public Universal Friends settled. That was where Mother Ann Lee, the female leader of the Shakers, settled her movement, which eventually expanded as far west as Ohio and as far south as Kentucky. The reason that Central New York State seemed to be ground zero for everything that was unusual and avant-garde in American life for about a generation in the 19th century is probably that, as I mentioned, the land was open to settlement and colonial expansion after the War of Independence. It had been home to the Iroquois nation. And during the Revolutionary War, the Iroquois made the very unfortunate tactical choice of allying with the British. And after U.S. forces won, they used the Iroquois alliance with the British as a pretext to do what they had wanted to do for many, many years, which was to push the Iroquois out of Central New York State and to open that land to settlement. And the settlers who arrived in Central New York State were fairly liberal New Englanders who had left behind their homes, their churches, their family ties, and they were a ripe congregation for anybody who was spreading new ideas. If you take a look at population flows in America and in other parts of the world, you'll always find that wherever there are big flows of population, that's where you'll discover the new religious movements. Wherever people are unmoored from their childhood faiths, congregations, businesses, social ties, they are ripe for receiving new ideas, joining new clubs, new congregations. This is true in California, and it's never stopped. It began in earnest, really, with an economic boom that started in California in the early 20th century, spilling over into the First World War, and it's continued. As population flows continue in California, it continues to be the driving engine of everything that is new and unique and novel in religious thought. I think there are other reasons as well, and I'll touch on that a little bit later. But Central New York State, as the home of the Public Universal Friend, who died in 1827, became a kind of compass point for people who were religious radicals. And it was noted, and it was paid attention to, that there were female religious leaders cropping up in Central New York State, in particular Jemima and Mother Ann Lee, the British leader of the Shaker movement. They were called the Shaking Quakers. They were a radical religious sect that had been accused of witchcraft in their hometown of Manchester, England. They crossed the Atlantic. They relocated briefly in New York City in 1775. 1776, Mother Ann Lee led a small group of followers to a town just outside of Albany, New York, and they started the first Shaker village. There are remnants of it still there, including Mother Ann Lee's gravestone, which I went up to pay homage to, and it stands adjacent to an abandoned insane asylum, which I broke into, and it was terrifying and horrifying, and I don't recommend it, but it's all there. So interestingly enough, here in this area of central New York State that became known as the Burned Over District, a place burned over by the fires of the Spirit, a small but revolutionary note was struck in the winter of 1848. There was a little log cabin occupied by a Methodist family in the village of Hydesville, outside Rochester, New York. And the mother and father who presided over this little household were hearing raps and bumps and bangs throughout the cabin, sometimes all night. And two of their young adolescent daughters, Kate and Margaret Fox, told them that these noises were spirit raps. And Kate and Margaret explained to their shocked Methodist parents that they had figured out a way of communicating with the other world through a series of knocks and raps. And this started to make news in various papers and pamphlets, and people heard about it, and judges and clergymen and doctors and scientists descended on the cabin to investigate Kate and Margaret's claims. And what do you know? They came away almost to a person with the conclusion that the girls are telling the truth. They do seem to have worked out some system of ghostly communication through knocks and raps with the spirit world. And thus was born the movement that became known as Spiritualism, which involved seance circles and midnight raps and sitting around your fireplace communicating with the ghosts and spirits of lost loved ones. There was a medium named Andrew Jackson Davis who published a manual in 1851 for how to organize yourself into a seance club or a seance circle. Seance, loosely speaking, was a French term for sitting. It has no exact translation. And people followed Andrew Jackson Davis's instructions, and they were inspired by the example of the young Fox sisters. And in no time at all, you had literally dozens of spiritualist or seance societies, clubs, newspapers popping up all over the United States. Enormously popular movement. I crunched the numbers very, very carefully in Occult America, and my conclusion is, based on the number of clubs and newspapers that were in existence, about 10% of American adults by the mid-1850s were involved with spiritualism in one form or another. It was a mass movement. It was a mass movement. And it all started in this little log cabin in the town of Hydesville, based on the claims of these two young teenage girls. Why? Why did such a movement become popular so quickly? I think one of the reasons is that something about the experience of Kate and Margaret tapped the American psyche. People were very excited by the idea, even though women not only couldn't vote, but couldn't speak publicly, could hold virtually no jobs or positions, had no material or civil rights in society. And yet, people were very aroused by the idea that these two young girls could function in the role of biblical prophet or ancient priestess. They were piercing the veil to the unknown, and they were doing it without the assistance or the approbation or the permission of the man in the robes. There was no institutional trapping. There was no religious sanction. It was just two kids in a log cabin, and they were communicating with the unseen. And the best in American ideals was attracted and drawn by this. People were excited by the idea that unseen or mystical communication wasn't something that belonged to a lost biblical past or a distant, mist-shrouded pagan antiquity, but it could occur in a little log cabin, in a little town that nobody had even heard of. And women in particular were attuned to this message. And as seance circles began to crop up around the country, most of the mediums seated at these seance tables were women. Most of the figures presiding over these spiritualist meetings through seance clubs or societies were women. And this was, and listen to this very, very carefully, this was the first time in modern life that women were able to occupy positions of religious leadership, and it was of an arcane and occult sort. Why are kids not being taught this? Why are college students, in many cases, not being taught this? I haven't even introduced the dawn of the suffragist movement, which I will in a moment. But you can see how significant this was. Women had no voice whatsoever in the civic or religious culture. None. And yet through the advent of spiritualism, through the function of serving as a medium at the seance table, for the first time, women were garnering a voice. And look where it started, in somebody's little log cabin in a town that nobody heard of. And it ignited a revolution. Madame Blavatsky herself said she came to America because she saw America as the cradle of spiritualism, and that's what she wanted to be a part of. And look at what she ignited. Not only the revolution in alternative spirituality, but an influence on Gandhi, an influence on the Indian National Congress that resulted in arguably the most significant nonviolent political revolution in human history. Why don't we know these things? Why don't our kids know these things? I was talking about this on YouTube, and somebody wrote to me and said, look, I was a women's studies minor and I never heard of any of this stuff. And I said, well then shame on your professors. Shame on your professors. Because they should be teaching you this stuff. Because if they're not teaching you this stuff, there's an arterial breakage in our understanding of our own history. 6 months after the Hydesville rappings, about 40 miles down the road, which was what we today call US Route 20, still there, about 40 miles down the road, east of Hydesville, in 1848 was held the first Seneca Falls Conference for Women's Rights. It's not a coincidence. Same neighborhood, same place. And there was a period of about one generation in the 19th century where you literally could not find a suffragist activist who had not spent some time at the seance table, and vice versa. You couldn't find a medium who herself was not involved to some degree or another with the suffragist movement. The two grew up like strands of DNA, completely wrapped together. Now, later in her life, Susan B. Anthony was an agnostic or an atheist, but when she was younger, she too, of course, was very taken with the spiritualist movement. And she was very admiring of these female mediums who, for the very first time, were giving women a voice in public life. And she wrote a letter to her collaborator, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and she was confessing to Stanton that she felt embarrassed in her efforts to speak publicly. She was experiencing difficulty to speak in front of crowds. And she wrote to her, this was an actual letter in her own handwriting, she wrote to her, "Oh, how I wish I could be a spirit medium for 2 weeks." By which she meant, how I wish I could gain that sense of confidence and ability to preside over a meeting, to speak to people. Well, she did find her voice. She did find her voice. But she was inspired by the examples of the mediums at the seance table. It is impossible to understand the spiritualist experience in America without understanding its political dimensions. And it is impossible to understand the suffragist experience in America without grasping its occult dimensions. It just can't be done. We're reading half a history, one cut off from the other, whereas they're part of an organic whole. I mentioned that spiritualism attracted in the mid-1850s about 10% of the adults in America. And this was true across all walks of life, including in the White House. Mary Todd Lincoln, later the First Lady, was herself a committed spiritualist. And she organized at least 2 seances in the White House. And it's quite remarkable. These were both during the Civil War. And we know of one as a fact because Abraham Lincoln permitted a reporter from the Boston Telegraph to be present at one of the White House seances that was held in the Red Room during the first year of the Civil War. Now, there is a full and very detailed article that appeared in the Boston, the papers of the Boston Gazette. Did I say Telegraph? Gazette. There is a full and very complete article in the Boston Gazette that depicts one of these seances that were held in the White House. And in the article, Abraham Lincoln, Mary Todd Lincoln, Lincoln's Secretary of Navy, Lincoln's Secretary of War, a couple of other cabinet secretaries are present. And there's a medium named Charles Shockle, who fainted twice during the course of the evening, who's contacting different spirits, including of vanquished Native American tribes. And Lincoln is talking to them about the progress in the war, asking for advice on the war. And this is all being recorded by a newspaper reporter. And Carl Sandburg, Lincoln's great biographer, wondered, why would Lincoln permit a newspaper reporter to be present at something that you could presume would be very embarrassing to the president? But this was a misunderstanding of the way Americans thought about spiritualism by this time. For some people, it was a very deep and serious commitment, and for some people, it was a novelty. And I think at this particular evening, for Lincoln, it was a novelty. And he invited a reporter to be present because it demonstrated the commander-in-chief as being somewhat relaxed, not overly encumbered by wartime command, and able to kind of kick back and experiment with a parlor novelty that maybe other Americans were trying out or were testing out. And I think Lincoln's gambit was correct, because the story actually got reprinted in 2 newspapers of the Confederacy. And I think that's what Lincoln wanted. It displayed him as sort of relaxed and having an evening off from the encumbrances of wartime command. But for Mary Todd Lincoln, spiritualism was a gravely, gravely serious matter. And she sat there silently the whole night. And there's another record, a more serious one, of her inviting a medium into the White House named Nettie Colburn Maynard. Nettie Colburn Maynard. And at this meeting, which we have more scant record of, so I can't absolutely validate its truth as I can the first one, but at this meeting, according to Maynard, she conducted another seance for the Lincolns after being escorted by Mary Todd into their living quarters. And she said to Abraham Lincoln that the messages that she's receiving from the spirits are that he should sign the Emancipation Proclamation. And if he signed the Emancipation Proclamation, it would be the greatest thing for which he would be remembered. And she said, I'm getting messages from the spirits that you are being subjected to undue pressure not to sign the Emancipation Proclamation. Is that correct? And he said, my dear child, that is absolutely true. You have no idea the pressure that's weighing upon me. And what's interesting about this story, which was written many years later, is not precisely whether it's true or not. I cannot absolutely validate its truth because the evidence is more scant and circumstantial. But it's important to note that spiritualism conceived of itself as a progressive spiritual movement, as a progressive social movement. By this time, it had a network of clubs and newspapers, and it had a certain degree of political clout. And the message that Nettie Colburn Maynard wanted to get across to the president was, you should sign the Emancipation Proclamation. That was exactly the spirit of progress and humanitarianism that spiritualism associated itself with. It saw itself as a liberatory movement that was freeing people from an old calcified social order in which religious and social life was controlled by a church structure that made no room for the supernatural, no room for the mystical, and no room for female leadership. Almost immediately after the Civil War ended, there was a spiritualist newspaper which had a very large circulation called the Banner of Light that wrote an editorial encouraging the federal government not to execute leaders of the Confederacy, which was a big discussion underway at the time. Spiritualism took early positions against child labor, against capital punishment, for universal suffrage. Took positions of abolitionism. It conceived of itself as a progressive spiritual and political movement that was superseding the old religious order. And its leaders were almost entirely women. Its editors, its writers, its mediums. What does Mary Todd Lincoln do? She brings spirit mediums into the White House. This has remained consistently true. This has been a facet of history in all kinds of ways. You know, I don't know if you all remember this. Some of you may. During Bill Clinton's first term in office, when the right wing was trying to figure out its various reasons for hating Hillary Clinton, for a period of a few months, one of the reasons that they found for hating her was that she was supposedly a New Ager. Nobody thinks of Hillary Clinton today as a New Ager, but she had a reputation as being a New Ager early in Bill Clinton's presidency. And she was depicted on the cover of the New York Times Magazine with the headline said something like Saint Hillary, and it showed her bathed in this white light so that she was supposed to look like an ascended master. So we went through this very brief phase of having to hate Hillary Clinton because she was a New Ager. And the fact is, she was bringing some spiritual guides and advisors into the White House, two of whom were friends of mine. One was a very liberal, radical rabbi named Michael Lerner, who she was spending some time with. And one was a New Age teacher who some of you might have heard of. Maybe you've read her books or taken her classes, Jean Houston. Do you guys know Jean Houston? Yes.
I've heard her actually encourage
Oh, here. Oh, cool. Oh, okay. Well, Hillary became friends with Jean Houston. And Jean is a spiritual teacher, somewhat in the mold of Joseph Campbell, although she's her own person. And she teaches about the applications of ancient myth and archetype to contemporary life. And somebody must have leaked this, but Jean was guiding Hillary through certain creativity sessions where she would ask Hillary to imagine that she was speaking with some of her heroes and to challenge her to ask her heroes what role she thought she should have been charting for herself as First Lady. And so one of Hillary's heroes was Eleanor Roosevelt. And so they had these sessions where she imagined speaking to Eleanor Roosevelt, and somebody must have leaked this, and it got reported in the Washington Post by Bob Woodward as Hillary is holding seances in the White House with this crazy, berobed, New Age teacher, Jean Houston. And I don't think Jean was able to grasp the bad faith in which some of these stories were being written, and it was difficult for her to explain to Bob Woodward and some of the reporters who were covering this that these weren't seances, they were creativity sessions. Probably to somebody like Bob Woodward, creativity sessions sounded weirder than seance. It probably would have been easier to say, yes, they were seances. But the more she explained it, the more people sort of circled like piranhas and were just bent on this sensationalistic story that Hillary was holding seances in the White House. That really wasn't what they were doing, but that was the headline, and for several weeks it conveniently fit the need of some people to hate Hillary Clinton until they came up with some other reason to hate her. And Bill Clinton himself sat in just on one of these sessions. And Jean personally told me that he really wasn't very into any of this stuff, but he did come in and he sat down at Hillary's behest for one of these sessions. And Jean said she turned to Bill and she was talking to him and she told him, you know what you are? You're an undeveloped shaman. And at that point, he didn't say anything. He just got up and walked out of the room. So that was her brush with the presidency. But these things do repeat themselves, because the fact is, people who are in positions of power tend to reflect the interests and the spiritual commitments of the rest of the population at large. I wish. Not seances, but Nancy did consult with an astrologer named Joan Quigley, who was a society astrologer to the rich and the well-heeled in San Francisco. I spoke about the Reagans last night, and they have a long history and as much an interest in the occult as any Hollywood couple who spent 30 years of their lives in the movie business. As I was saying last night, who else were they going to be friends with? They would simply have to sit at home by themselves. Reagan's friends were a who's who of the West Coast occult, including the psychic Jean Dixon, who Nancy later broke with because Jean Dixon, as distinctive from Jean Houston, she did not foresee Ronald Reagan's rise to the White House. She thought he should stay in the governor's office, and that really got Nancy very angry. So she broke with Jean Dixon and then later gravitated towards Joan Quigley, who was from San Francisco. And he was friends with a real who's who of occult figures. Eden Gray, who wrote some of the first popular tarot guides in America, was a friend and co-star of Reagan in one of his early movies. A Santa Monica astrologer named Carol Ryder, who was the first and only astrologer to appear on the cover of Time magazine in 1969, was a close friend of Reagan's. So this goes on in all kinds of presidential administrations, and one of the things I found that's interesting is that for a period of time, there were astrologers and psychics in Washington who were very clearly demarcated as being either conservative or liberal. Jean Dixon, for example, was godmother to Senator Strom Thurmond's children. He was a segregationist, and Jean had some problems along those areas herself. And Jean Dixon also, at the behest of Nixon's secretary, met with Richard Nixon in the Oval Office in 1972. And we know this because the meeting has been preserved on Watergate tapes that Nixon was making at the time. And one doesn't necessarily think of Richard Nixon as a man of occult passions, but there he was in the Oval Office meeting with the psychic Jean Dixon. Again, Jean was associated with conservative political thought, and she was conservative, quite explicitly so. And she said, he didn't seem to take the meeting altogether seriously. She said to him, "You have been anointed by God to be a great leader, and you are the man who can bring our entire nation together." And Nixon sort of scoffed and laughed and said, "Well, you could sell anything." But interestingly enough, she told Nixon that there was some plot afoot where a group of black nationalists or Black Panthers were going to attempt to kidnap a group of notable figures. And Nixon, in response to Jean Dixon telling him this, summoned Henry Kissinger, who at the time was his national security advisor, into his office. And he starts telling Kissinger, and this is on tape, that this soothsayer, as he called it, he referred to her as a soothsayer, was explaining this to him, that there was this plot. And Nixon, in this inimitable way of his, said, "Who knows what the shit could go on around here? She could be correct. I want you to get a blue ribbon panel on this, Henry, and I don't want any jerks from the State Department on it. I want it people here in the West Wing." And he's telling Kissinger, get together a panel. He wanted him to respond to the security threats that Jean Dixon had predicted, and Kissinger, having no choice, said, "Yes, of course, I'll do that. It's not clear that this panel ever came together, but he did take her advice sufficiently seriously enough so that he had a taped meeting about it. But the point that I'm making is, you can always select and find episodes of famous people who avail themselves of the occult. But what you find present in the story of the occult and in the story of women's rise into positions of rights and political expression and civil expression and religious expression in America is that the occult actually served as a vehicle for this. There was this intrinsic, organic, arterial connection between the spiritualist movement and the emergence and development of the suffragist movement. And the effects of this were felt all around the world. As I referenced, Madame Blavatsky came to America explicitly because she wanted to come to the cradle of spiritualism. And she said, "I came to America like a Muslim approaching Mecca because this was the birthplace of spiritualism." And her impact was felt all over the world, not only in revivals in Hinduism and Buddhism, not only in the liberation of India, arguably the most significant nonviolent revolution in political history, but also in the formation of Gandhi's own philosophy of universal personhood and nonviolence, which traveled back to America in the influence and the impact that Gandhi had on the figure of Martin Luther King. Something I spoke about last time in my talk on Occult America. You cannot underestimate the ripple effects of these things, and you cannot get your arms around the history of liberatory, contemporary, modern liberatory movements, particularly women's liberatory movements, without understanding the extent to which the occult served as a vehicle for this material, for this progress, for this usurpation of calcified social and political forms of power. Now, Why is the occult so vital and so central to contemporary and especially to women's liberatory movements? I started off by saying to you that I was frustrated with the extent to which mainstream journalism and academia always looks for sociological explanations. And I've given you some of the sociological explanations, and they have validity, and they're important, and we have to take account of them. But as I was saying to my friend at the Atlantic Monthly magazine, and as I've said to other reporters, you must never take off the table the possibility of the extra-physical, the possibility of the mythical, of the supernatural. You must never exclude the claims and testimony of the speaker from your analysis of what's going on. What's going on. So in that vein and in that spirit, I want to conclude this talk tonight with an explanation that emerges from the mythical and that emerges from a counter reading and an esoteric reading of that most familiar of religious parables, and that is the supposed fall from paradise, the supposed fall of man, as is recorded in Genesis 3, that began with the wily serpent, or Satan, inducing Eve to eat the apple, and then Eve, the wayward woman, according to the conventional reading of religious history, seduced Adam into eating the apple. And hence began humanity's fall, and they were shunted from paradise and gave birth to sons, Cain and Abel, who committed an act of fratricide. Thus begins the tragic arc of human history. Is that what happened? Is that what happened? I maintain that there can be a counter reading of Genesis 3. I maintain that the heroes of Genesis 3, in my counter reading, are not Adam and God, but are the serpent and Eve, and ultimately Cain. I say there's a radical and supportable esoteric counter reading of Genesis 3 that elevates to primacy the serpent and Eve. And it goes like this. Here we have a so-called Garden of Paradise with a man and a woman who are kept and protected and cared for, and all of their material needs are taken care of, provided they abide by one bargain. And the bargain is that there is this tree of knowledge of good and evil growing in the midst of the garden, and it will bring you self-awareness, and it will bring you measurement, and it will bring you creativity. But the deal is, you must never eat from it. That doesn't sound to me like paradise. That sounds to me like a living, eternal nightmare. You'll always be taken care of. Always. Every need will be met. You'll have all the food you could want. All the animals will be tame. You'll never know fear. You'll never need clothing, but you must never taste of the fruit from this tree of knowledge of good and evil. What kind of creator would require such a bargain of his or her creations? Why would you even erect such a tree that cannot be eaten from? Why would you even create forbidden fruit of intellectual awareness and illumination, if only to say that your safety and your comforts and your sense of peace and security are incumbent upon you never tasting that which will put you on equal footing to he who creates. So along comes the snake, the serpent, supposedly hated in Western tradition, and yet we continue to be very, very attracted to him. And he says to Eve, "Why do you not eat from this tree of knowledge of good and evil?" And Eve says, "Well, the Creator told us that if we eat from this tree, we will die." And the serpent tells her the truth. This is in the book. The serpent says to her, "Oh no, that's not true. If you eat from this tree, you surely will not die. You'll be illumined. You'll gain knowledge of good and evil. Who's telling you you'll die? You're being misled." So Eve does eat from the tree, and she doesn't die. The serpent told her the truth, didn't he? Nor is it in the story that she seduces Adam into eating the apple. That's like the story of the Mercedes-Benz in The Secret. It's not there. Go back and read it tonight. She comes to Adam and she says, "The serpent told me that I could eat from this tree and that I wouldn't die. And here I am, I haven't died." And Adam says, "Well, give me that. I'll eat that too." He didn't require seduction. He saw the evidence of his own eyes that they had been misled. And they eat the fruit and they disobey and they're aware. And God is very, very angry. And they are shunted from the garden. And they give birth to two offspring, Cain and Abel. And as we all know, of course, there's fratricidal violence, and Cain, without intending to, kills Abel. But he sees Abel as somebody who is constantly showing him up, cajoling him, pushing him to believe in a creator who Cain thinks of as unjust. And when Cain commits his act of fratricide, he didn't do it with the intention of committing murder, but death did occur. Death did occur. And it is possible that the price that humanity pays for independence of thought, for creativity, for intellect, for point of view, for measurement, for creation itself, the price is friction. The price is friction. Because other people have that too. Other people have that too. It's tragic, yes. But we wouldn't be creators, and we wouldn't be human in the way that we aspire to be if we didn't have our own self-conception of what we wanted to create and shape and communicate in the world. And that does come with a price. That does come with a price. But what is the alternative? What is the alternative to forever being taken care of and feeling safe, so long as we never, never taste the forbidden fruit of personhood? My contention is that maybe there's a legitimate and entirely defensible counter-narrative in Western life that is as neglected as some of the history that we've been talking about. And it is this, that the story of our creation is not the story of Adam and Eve. It is the story of the serpent and Eve. And they are the actual heroes of Genesis 3. And that is why women, as with Eve, are constantly harnessing forces of the cosmic represented by the serpent and leading us ever forward. And thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.